Hello everyone. Welcome back to this channel, depending on whether or not this is your first time here. So today I'm going to be making a video that's kind of part of what's become a series here on the channel at this point, where what I do is I take a subject which I consider myself to be well versed in. I then find a tier list related to it and rank it, pretty much. I rank whatever said subtopics within the topic are, and odds are you probably know how a tier list works. So today that choice of subject is the Captain Underpants book series by Dav Pilkey. This was one of my favorites as a kid, so I do consider myself to be well versed in it. And before I do actually get started, though, a few things I want to say. First, I am going to be explaining the details of each of these books as I rank through them. So if you have not read this book, if you have not read any of these books or only some of them, there will be some spoilers and you have been warned. Second, I do know that there are other sort of sub-series that are, I guess, quote-unquote canon with the main series. But I just wanted to focus on the core series, so the 12 books where it's about the two main characters, George and Harold, and their principal turned superhero. So without that out of the way, let's begin. I'm going to be doing these in order, so we are going to start with the very first book in the series, The Adventures of Captain Underpants. This one, I would consider it to be right in the middle as far as the tier list rankings go. So, the premise of this book, at least to start out, is George and Harold are these fourth graders who are kind of these prankster, kind of troublemaker-ish type kids. You know, they don't really care about doing good in school, that kind of whole thing. And they have to deal with these strict teachers and a very strict principal named Mr. Krupp, who kind of lords over the school. So one day, they decide to pull this ultimate prank on the football team. And, excuse me a sec. Water. Yeah, so they pull this ultimate prank on the football team at their school. So then they do all these crazy things, like they put helium in the football, causing it to float up into the air. They can't actually play. They make something that causes the fans in the stands to itch and scratch themselves like crazy, so they can't enjoy the game. And then, but it turns out that as they're doing all of these things, somebody is recording them. They send that recording to Mr. Krupp, the principal, who calls them into his office and shows them that they did not get away with what they did. So he then gives them a choice. He can either show it to the football team, who will then proceed to make their lives miserable for who knows how long, or they can do his chores and extra homework and all sorts of other things to make their lives miserable that way. They choose the latter, and this goes on for a few weeks until eventually they find this little article about something called a 3D hypno ring, and they order it to get out of this whole thing, to get out of this whole blackmail that they're stuck in. Up next, they go to Mr. Krupp's office and hypnotize him to think he's Captain Underpants. They play around for a little while, and then they make him think he's Captain Underpants. He proceeds to jump out the window and run to fight crime, because, for a little context, Captain Underpants originally was a fictional character within the world that George and Harold made up, and George and Harold are super into drawing comics, or really I should say, George writes the comics, Harold illustrates them, and then so now they have to go chase their principal, who thinks he's a superhero now. They eventually run into this abandoned warehouse and find this guy, or they don't run into the abandoned warehouse. What happens is these two robots think Mr. Krupp is. These two robots find Mr. Krupp, who thinks he's Captain Underpants, kidnap him, and then they take him to this abandoned warehouse where they tie him up, and they find this guy named Dr. Diaper. George and Harold chase them along the way, so they're still with them, and Dr. Diaper is going to make Captain Underpants watch as he fires this destruction ray he made at the moon and send chunks of it raining all across the city. So George and Harold decide, all right, we need to stop this guy. They proceed to make him. They brought this fake dog poop along the way, and they make him think he pooped because they slingshot it right in between his legs, or right behind between his legs, I should say. Make him run to the bathroom, and then they then beat up the robots that kidnapped their principal to begin with, and then they break that whole laser ray thing, and get him arrested. They then take their principal / superhero back home, or not back home, back to the school, and they proceed to try and unhypnotize him out of that. And then they eventually find what they believe is the trick, where they pour water on his head, and he goes back to acting like his grumpy self. Mr. Krupp is a very grumpy man. But this in turn creates this effect where anytime somebody snaps his fingers, he would go back into thinking he is Captain Underpants, and if you want to stop him, pour water on his head, he becomes the Mr. Krupp, the principal again. So, like I said, overall, this book was not great, but good by itself at least. You know, it had to introduce all the context, which I just gave you, to the series. And at least when you compare it to many of these other ones, as you're gonna see later on, it's kind of lackluster just based on that. I believe it was also shorter in the page length, so that would explain why the storyline might not feel as deep, I guess. Which brings me to the next book in the series, Captain Underpants and the Attack of the Talking Toilets, which I do think was overall a tad better than the original. Excuse me a sec. So the plot in this one is George and Harold are at this invention, or there's about to be this invention convention at the school. George and Harold are banned because Mr. Krupp knows that if they are involved, they'll use it as an opportunity to pull some crazy prank again. By the way, they got themselves out of the whole blackmail chain. I forgot exactly how in the first book, at the end of the first book, but that's beside the point. Yeah, so in the second book, George and Harold are barred from this invention convention. They run into this other student named Melvin, who's like a teacher's pet / nerd type kid, and so they want to still like get everybody and pull a prank on them again, but they know they can't do it. So they run into this storage room where all the inventions are stored. They run into Melvin there because he's like the only student there, and they make a deal with him to not mess with his invention as long as he keeps it secret that they're going about their pranking business again. So they do this to everybody's invention except Melvin's, which is this Patsy 2000, where he sticks you can stick pictures inside something and then it'll come to life. They think it's a photocopier because I guess just because. So they ruin everybody else's invention. The next day, everyone goes on stage. They watch everything go into chaos. Um, Melvin decides to break his side of the promise with George and Harold and tells on Mr. Krupp. George and Harold go get sucked into detention. While they're there, they make a Captain Underpants comic, which they call Captain Underpants and the Attack of the Talking Toilets, funny enough. And they then want a way to distribute copies out to people at the school. So they go into Melvin's Patsy thinking it's the photocopier. And then it turns out it was real. Actual talking toilets come out and eat everyone in the school except for George, Harold, and Mr. Krupp. Somebody along the line snaps their fingers at some point, and this causes Krupp to turn into Captain Underpants. So they have to defeat all these talking toilets now. So they resort to feeding them school food cafeteria, which I guess is really awful. I know there's kind of a running gag about school lunches being horrible. And this kills off all the talking toilets, except for one. The sort of leader is the Turbo Toilet 2000, and he comes out after all his minions, I guess, died out, and Mr. Krupp in Captain Underpants form tries to beat him up. It goes horribly. So George and Harold draw up this robo plunger guy who's like this big robot dude. Put him in the Patsy 2000 thing because it's still active, or it still functions, I guess. And he comes out, defeats the Turbo Toilet 2000. Everyone gets plunged out of the toilets because the toilets ate everybody. And then they make the robot go to Uranus. I thought that was kind of an amusing way of clearing the robot and all the things out of the storyline. And then everything quote unquote goes back to normal except Mr. Krupp except the Mr. Krupp Captain Underpants dichotomy is still a thing. So, like I said, overall, I thought this one was not great but good as well. The thing that puts this one a little bit above the original is the fact that you can actually jump into the storyline and kind of enjoy a whole adventure instead of in the first half of the first book, you know, it's this whole slog of just introducing everything and kind of creating a backstory, I guess, to what the meat and potatoes of the series are. So this one is a few notches better, book 2. Up next in the third book in the series, which is Captain Underpants and the invasion of the naughty cafeteria ladies and a whole bunch of extra things. This one was notorious for having a very long title. So in this one, George and Harold don't entirely cause the problem like they technically did in the first two, although I guess if they didn't do what they did in the first book, the moon chunks would have rained on the Earth at this point in the series, but that's beyond the point. Excuse me a sec. So in this one, these 3 alien dudes land their spaceship on top of the school, and nobody notices at first. But while this is going on, George and Harold prank the lunch ladies by doing this cupcake thing, or by making this fake cupcake recipe for them to bake, and it just explodes into this giant flood of goop, which floods the whole school. Mr. Krupp fires them as a result of this, and the alien people, the 3 alien guys, I guess. I think they're guys. I don't know. They take advantage of this, dress up as lunch ladies the best they can, and become the new lunch ladies. They talk to Mr. Krupp, and he agrees to hire them, not knowing who they actually are. And so they then create all these crazy lunch recipes, which are actually these mind control tools to turn all of the students and teachers in the school into their obedient slaves slash zombie nerds, as I remember the book called them. So up next, George and Harold have to find out how to defeat them, and then um so they overhear them talking about their ultimate plans, because they had more plans beyond what they actually did up to that point. So they expose them to Mr. Krupp. They expose that they're actually aliens and all that. The alien then gets mad and proceeds to snap their fingers, prompting Mr. Krupp to turn into Captain Underpants once more. They then try to fight them, the three of them, but this doesn't work, and they get kidnapped and placed in a spaceship, which they then have to find their way out of. They eventually find a method to blow it up by messing around with gadgets and labels on different things they have. So overall, I thought this one was a little bit weaker than Attack of the Talking Toilets, but it still had a pretty decent and interesting plot to follow. So I would put it in the B tier as well. Up next, the fourth book in the series is Captain Underpants and the Perilous Plot of Professor Poopy Pants. I would say this one is a few notches better, at least, than the first three. So in this one, what happens is there's this scientist guy who's pretty smart named Professor Poopy Pants, who comes from this fictional country. I forgot its name. And in this country, everybody has a silly name. I guess that's part of the culture there or whatever. And so he goes to all these universities expecting to get praise for being a smart guy, because he's like this guy who can come up with all these inventions and things, but everybody just laughs his name off. So eventually he decides maybe being a fourth grade science teacher is the solution. The old teacher who was there, Mr. Fide, happens to resign right before this, because he thinks he's going crazy, citing events from the previous three books as evidence that he is going crazy, thinking that it's like hallucinations or whatever. And then so he leaves. Professor Poopy Pants comes in, and the kids make fun of him the same way everybody else does, right? They don't take him seriously. They just think about how his name is silly, and that's all that matters to him. That's all that matters to them about him. He finally is getting fed up with this, and says that if just one more thing happens, he is going to lose his mind. That one more thing ends up being George and Harold writing a comic book about him, where they make fun of his name and make him a villain in their little Captain Underpants comic book. This ends up causing him to snap. So he takes this gerbil robot invention thing and gigantifies it, because the two things he invented were a Shrinky Pig 2000 and a Goosey Girl 4000. What they do is probably self-explanatory. So he uses the Goosey Girl thing to grow his gerbil outfit, and then uses the Shrinky Pig 2000 to shrink down the school with everybody inside it. He then makes everybody change their name to something silly, and as a sort of a humiliation means, I guess, vengeance. And the news covers it, yada, yada, yada. And so George and Harold now realize that they kind of have to get their way out of the situation, as they made a monster. So they this time, for the first time, George and Harold voluntarily turn Mr. Krupp into Captain Underpants. I believe that this happened for the first time in this book. I could be wrong. But anyway, Mr. Krupp becomes Captain Underpants once again, and this time he can fly. Because at the end of the third book, Captain Underpants or Mr. Krupp in Captain Underpants form drank superpower juice, which gave him super strength and the ability to fly. So even though he's tiny, he can sort of counter that using a bunch of methods. So Captain Underpants flies out of the window at school, tries to fight Professor Poopy Pants. It doesn't go well. He gets shrunken twice, so now he's basically microscopic. But then George and Harold find a way to sort of steal the Goosey Grow 4000. I think they that's right. Captain Underpants steals the Goosey Grow 4000, but gets shrunk to microscopic size in the process. And then, but George and Harold use that to their advantage. They grow him, they grow him gigantic, make him beat up Professor Poopy Pants the Machine, and once again everything is restored to normal. This time, or this one, I felt was the best one in the series so far. I thought the whole shrinking and growing concept, as well as the you have to change your name to something silly thing, was much more interesting than any of the sort of jokes that they threw in the first 3 books. So I remember that one being much more engaging the first time I read it, and subsequent times after, because I came back and reread these a little more times than I probably should have. But anyway, moving on. We are on book 5, Captain Underpants and the Wrath of the Wicked Wedgie Woman. This was another one which I thought was decent. I remember this was the last one. So, little backstory about my experience with the series. I remember getting a package of the first 5 books in, was it first or second grade? One of the two. Anyway, so I remember getting a package of the first 5 books and reading through them, and I didn't even know any of the ones after that existed up to this point. And excuse me a sec. So these 5 books were kind of like my first impression, I guess you could say. And yeah. But anyway, to the actual plot of this one. George and Harold are dealing with their teacher, Miss Ribble, who is kind of doing what Mr. Krupp was trying to do in the first book. Not in the exact same way, but similar. So they pull out the 3D hypno ring, once again, hypnotize her. However, because for some weird reason, she does the opposite of whatever she's told to do, and just because they made a comic about her being a haha wicked wedgie woman earlier on, and they said don't do anything like turn into wedgie woman. So she does exactly that because she does the opposite of whatever she's told to, and this causes her to become a monster wreaking havoc on everyone in the city. This is the first time that the adventure takes, I would say the majority of the adventure actually takes place outside of George and Harold's school, which becomes a more common theme in later books in the series. And so they then have to get Captain Underpants to save them once again. And this time, what happened exactly? And this time, Captain Underpants cannot win because of a sort of psychological trick she plays on him, where he thinks spray starch, which she somehow gets, takes away his superpowers. So then George and Harold have to make up this story about how he about how Captain Underpants can say a certain line based on his original planet, and restore his superpowers that way. And so then they defeat Wedgie Woman, aka Miss Ribble. They I thought it was funny when they got the hair balding spray starch, and it causes everybody to go bald, at least in the area. So now their teacher's bald. So overall, I thought this one was good. By the way, they also use double reverse psychology on their teacher to sort of get her under their thumb at the end, so she becomes a not strict teacher. But anyway, I thought this one wasn't quite as good as the Professor Poopy Pants one, and it was like somewhere in between Talking Toilets and Very Long Title, which I'm not gonna say again because that's just too much. Anyway, one thing I did notice about this one is this was actually the first time it took a step outside the whole something crazy happens and then George and Harold have to make it go back to normal, barring the Mr. Krupp Captain Underpants dichotomy. Because now, at the very beginning, and in the books before it, Miss Ribble is sort of like this mean, cranky teacher who just yells at her students all the time. And but now she's nice because of the whole hypnosis thing. And yeah, this one was just kind of an okay entry, at least by the standards of the series, I would say. Up next is part one of a sort of two-part series, and also the first one in the series where the whole quote-unquote everything goes back to normal at the very end is broken at the end of this book. Captain Underpants and the Big Bad Battle of the Bionic Booger Boy, Part 1, The Night of the Nasty Nostril Nuggets. What a delightful to read title. Anyway, so in this one, George and Harold have to deal with their classmate Melvin again, who I spoke about a bit from the second book. But this time, he's much more of a nuisance to them, I guess. So he has this hamster named Sulu, who he found a way to fuse with a robotic bionic hamster, I guess, that he made. And so but he mistreats the hamster. The hamster wants to be with George and Harold instead, so they adopt him. This makes Melvin mad, and he decides he's gonna get revenge somehow by merging himself as a bionic robot, but by merging himself with a bionic robot. And but then what happens is, as he's about to fuse himself, he sneezes, and this causes him to be merged with a robot and his snot. Very appetizing, I know. Just excuse me a sec. So Melvin, so then Melvin goes to school the next day, and sort of evolves into this freak monster. He, the part about him getting bigger and bigger didn't really make much sense to me. So maybe I'd have to reread the book and check over that again. But regardless, so he evolves into this freak of nature Melvin evolves into this freak of nature that he created. George and Harold get Captain Underpants to stop him. Or they snap their fingers in front of Mr. Krupp to make him turn into Captain Underpants, thinking that this will stop him. If I remember correctly, this does work for a little while, but it doesn't do a whole lot. And then eventually they resort to this trick where they bear with me here. No. That's right. This is what happened. Captain Underpants beat Melvin in this monster form, causing him to like fall into a coma or whatever. And then they reverse the batteries on on the Combinatron 2000, which is Melvin's machine, which works in separating the parts from each other. And as a result, Melvin and Captain Underpants, because he got eaten up by Melvin before the defeat, break up or swim out of the thing. The whole snot monster machine, whatever you want to call it, breaks up in all sorts of pieces, and everything seems like it's going to go back to normal at first, except there's a few not plot holes. There's a few cliffhangers as this book ends. Now, the reason I actually put this one in the C tier and not with B like everything else, even though I thought the plot was overall fairly decent, is because Captain Underpants as a character isn't as central to the story in this one as he was to all of the previous ones. So I wasn't super fond of that. So that's why I think this one overall comes across a little bit weaker to me than most of the rest of the series. And with that out of the way, let's move on to part 2. I can't really read the title from here right now, and I don't quite remember what it was called, but I remember enjoying this one much more. So, unlike the other ones where George and Harold managed to restore everything back to normal at the end, this one picks up right from where it left off at the first one, and so the, I guess, Bionic Booger Boy would be the name of the monster machine thing Melvin turned into, breaks apart into 3 pieces, but they all come to life. However, Sulu, that bionic hamster from before, manages to defeat them by shooting them all into space instantaneously, and they run into a new problem where it turns out that the brains of Melvin and Mr. Krupp, from being, I guess, fused together in the whole machine, have their brains swapped. So they need a way to like reverse that around, but it takes some time. Or they have to work on something that'll take some time. But in the meantime, somebody snapped their fingers, and Kruppy the Kid, as he's called, because he's Mr. Krupp's brain inside Melvin's 4th grader body, thinks he's Captain Underpants and goes flying out the window. So he's gone out of the picture. In the meantime, George and Harold have to deal with Melvin and Mr. Krupp's body pretending he's the principal and gets to boss them around. However, George and Harold then respond by inventing a time machine, or they have to go back in time to the events of the first part of the series, so book 6, the one I put in the C tier here, and retrieve that Combinatron 2000 machine because it got broken at the end of the last one. And so they do that. They also go back in time to the Cretaceous era and pick up this dinosaur, which they name, or pterodactyl, which they name Crackers. And Crackers assist them in sort of flying around, or they take him back to the present, and they take Crackers back to the present after they get the Combinatron thing back. And excuse me a sec. Yeah, so they take Crackers back. I'm gonna finish this thought. Don't worry. And find Captain Underpants that way. Right as this is happening, the 3 bionic booger snot monsters manage to find their way back to Earth. They catch a space shuttle back home, and make their triumphant return to Earth. But then, because they called Captain Underpants, they Captain Underpants in Melvin's body. They 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 find him. He defeats the bionic monsters and tries to manipulate them into letting them keep their keep the superpowers, because the brains swapped but the superpowers did not. So Melvin is the one with the Captain Underpants superpowers that Mr. Krupp / Captain Underpants was supposed to have. And so because of this, he tries to like manipulate them into saying, "Oh, I defeated the monsters, so I should get to keep these superpowers." But George and Harold find a way to reverse this and defeat him, or they find a way to use the Combinatron 2000 to reverse things around, and everything, quote unquote, goes back to normal. Except this time, it's not officially back to normal like it would have been at the end of the first 5 books, because they have this whole time machine and they have the 2 pets now. So to get to actually rating this book, you'll see I put it in A tier. I thought that the plot of this was somewhat interesting, because in all the other ones, there's always this whole build-up of, oh, somebody does something weird and suddenly there's all these villains afoot. But book 7 is the first in the series where there's somewhat of a break from that. And so that made this one a little bit more interesting in my opinion. And with that out of the way, let's move on to book 8. So, Captain Underpants and the Preposterous Plight of the Purple Potty People. So, this one had some ups and downs to it, I would say. So, the plot of this one is kind of continuing from the tail end of the 7th book. So George and Harold have that time machine, which I mentioned before, which they call the Purple Potty, which Melvin, I guess, sort of handed off to them. And so for some reason, using the time machine 2 days in a row would cause problems. So they decide they want to bring Crackers, the pterodactyl they got from before, back to his original home, because, you know, he is not a... He was not meant to really stay with them. He was just meant to sort of assist them in flying around to a few places. But they forget about the rule. Or they go to send him back to the wild, but they forget about the 2 days rule. And doing so creates this alternate universe where everything is the opposite of what it's like in their world. So in their world, they're just nice kids who like to have fun. In the alternate universe, they're mean and they're cranky and old. Right? Their principal, Mr. Krupp, is a nice guy in this universe, whereas he's mean in the original universe. And so they decide, and so in this alternate universe, the backstory is that they turned him into their favorite supervillain they made up, Captain Blunderpants. And so now they have to deal with fighting off these doppelgangers, I guess, and send them back to their universe, because their evil versions are trying to take over their universe. So this one, I believed, was good. But, like I said before, this one was kind of a mixed bag. Because I did think the whole thing about creating evil versions of themselves was actually a very creative and interesting idea. and actually inspired a sort of and actually inspired a story idea that I did with a friend back then, which became sort of the foundation for our friendship, I would say. So, if you were to rate these by influence they have on my life, this one would probably be near the top because I'm still pretty good friends with that person to this day. But that's a whole nother story. Excuse me a sec. Water again. But the one thing I think that kind of pulls this one down is the fact that Captain Underpants, the actual character, is not very prevalent throughout the book. The way he is, similar to book 6, he's not central to the story, I guess, which I think is kind of a downside when you consider the title. But But so there's kind of this whole balance here. So I'm gonna say this is a solid B tier. But to continue with the plot a little bit, they feed their grandparents superpower juice, the same one that Mr. Krupp in Captain Underpants form took, which causes them to develop superpowers and defeat the evil versions of themselves, who they then send back to their old universe. Yeah, that's the premise of this plot. One thing a trend I have noticed actually as these book series go on is that in the earlier books, they're more focused around things like toilet humor and finding every opportunity they can to make a butt joke. And then as the series progresses, they they shift away from that and more toward pseudo sci-fi humor, like how they make up all these weird inventions. They come up with all these weird names for them. There's this one ridiculously long name, which is a recurring thing throughout the series. It starts with a Y. Yekto something. If you've read the book, you probably know what I'm talking about. But that's all I could really say about book 8. Moving on to book 9 in the series, Captain Underpants and the terrifying return of Tippy Tinkle Trousers. So in this one, Professor Poopy Pants comes back. He changed his name to Tippy Tinkle Trousers after being sick of being made fun of all the time for his name. Of course, this doesn't do much difference because if you know what that actually means, you'll know that it's just as silly sounding. And so he's back for revenge. This is at the end of the. This starts at the end of the 8th book, by the way, when he starts to make a comeback. So this one, although it's not directly mentioned, it's kind of part 1 in a 2-part series. Books 9 and 10 kind of go together. But in this one, it explains the whole backstory of how Tippy Tinkle Trousers gets out of jail because he got arrested at the end of the 4th book because Mr. Krupp got arrested for something at the start of the book. I forgot. And then so he so they find a way to break out. Tippy works on this machine thing that he built to break out of prison. George and Harold find Mr. Krupp and turn him into Captain Underpants, and so a big fight begins. This eventually Tippy tries to freeze Captain Underpants, but accidentally freezes himself in the process, or freezes his machine. So, but luckily, the time machine component of his machine, or luckily for him, I should say, the time machine component of his machine is still intact. So he time travels and goes back in time 5 years to an event. So it then proceeds to give this whole backstory behind how George and Harold met as sort of this side quest, which I think, here's the thing. I do think that story itself was interesting, But I feel like I wish it would have been done in such a way that it could have been a sort of prequel to the series instead of being meshed in with the actual parts of the book or the actual like trajectory of the series, where they have to defeat this bully named Kipper Krupp, who is Mr. Krupp's nephew and is several grades ahead of them. And so what ends up happening is Tippy Tinkletrousers happens to go back in time right as Kipper and his buddies are running across the school's football field, which seeing his machine makes them lose their minds and undoes the whole timeline of the Captain Underpants series because Mr. Krupp gets arrested and thus George and Harold are never there to hypnotize him to become Captain Underpants. So after Tippy does his little time travel escape type thing, he returns to the present and sees that without Captain Underpants, nobody was there to stop the events of the first 3 books from happening, and so the world is in ruins as a result of this. And so he realizes that he needs to go back in time to fix everything, and that causes and he does that by the events of the 10th book. So this brings me to book 10, where so they do this whole sort of gag where it seems like Tippy got crushed by giant zombie George and Harold at the end of book 9, but it turns out it was a fake. So he goes back in time, or he climbs back into his machine and goes back in time once more to what is it? To the event of Mr. Krupp's nephew and his friends running on the football field, and this causes he goes back right before that so that he can freeze them, talk to his previous self, and tell them what's going on. This creates this whole multi-character how do I say it? Multi-character, not dichotomy. What's the word I'm looking for? Like there's multiple Tippies now, and so they decide to team up and travel back to the present and defeat Captain Underpants the quote-unquote right way, because Tippy Tinkletrousers is just hellbent on defeating Captain Underpants at this point, and that's his mission in life. So Captain Underpants and the radioactive Roboboxers. I know that's what Captain Underpants is fighting against in this one, and I remember. So Tippy goes forward in time to the present, chases around George and Harold, and then they step into their purple potty machine with Captain Underpants / Mr. Krupp, and and time travel back to the Cretaceous period, because now the purple potty machine had its whole multi-day breakup, I guess. They didn't use it 2 days in a row, so now they could use it again. And then to send crackers back to the period it's from, and so then they find this dinosaur. It turns out Tippy, or the 3 Tippies now, because there ends up being 3 of them, finds them there, and chases them around. Eventually, they jump off a cliff. Meanwhile, the 2 shrunken Tippies get mad at the bigger one for bossing them around. So they travel forward in time to the present to get a Goosey Grow 4000, because I don't know if you remember this, but when he was still Professor Poopy Pants, Tippy was the character who invented those originally, so I guess he makes all sorts of copies for himself. Excuse me a sec. And so 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 then one of them grows themselves, decides to abandon the other one, goes back and finds the original big one, beats him up or like kicks him. Then that big one dies. They travel forward in time to the caveman era, like 200 something thousand years in the past, I think it said. And then and so then George, Harold, and Captain Underpants have to fight that Tippy. They get a bunch of cavemen, team up with them, get them that way, and then the other one that was still small from before ends up time traveling with them, and uh, uh, rigs the Freezy Beam 4000 machine that all of these Robo Boxer machines have, and and makes it so that it just cannot stop. So that the one that made himself big before is frozen in time. Then the one that was small makes himself even bigger, and then they travel to the future with George, Harold, Captain Underpants, the pets, the five of them, and Tippy travel to the future, and they have the final battle there, and they end up defeating him, but he escapes by going back in time to before the universe existed, and they make this whole thing about how, oh, the Big Bang Theory was fake, and it's this whole gag. I thought this whole series was actually pretty amusing. I thought the whole gag of how this historical event really happened this way, and it's Captain Underpants characters, was pretty hilarious, honestly. I'm actually gonna say this one was the first S tier. I know a lot of people don't like the later books in the series, but I think this one in particular was kind of top notch. I think in a way these books kind of grew up with me because, okay, so when I first started reading these books, the first 8 did exist, and then once I read through them all, I kind of forgot about them for about a year. But then I happened to see the 9th book shortly after it came out in a bookstore one day. I got it. That got me back into the series, and then the 9th and 10th books were really interesting. And because the plots of each of them were more complicated. Now I know I did say I find the 9th one in hindsight to be less good for the reasons I mentioned earlier. But because the actual plots were just less focused on silly toilet humor and didn't involve the whole quote-unquote back to normal thing from the earlier books, it actually made the plot much more interesting to follow, I would say. Oh, before we move on to the last two, I want to finish the plot of the 10th book. So, suddenly Melvin has this squid time travel machine. George and Harold can't go back in time because their purple potty time machine broke. So he finds them 30 years in the future, and he offers to take them back to the present because he managed to connect the dots of how they were there. They do know that what was I saying? We know how he figured out what happened to George and Harold because they discuss this in the next book in the series, the book 11, which I'll do in just a second. And so he takes them back in time 30 years to what would be the present day in the series, and that sets the stage for the adventures of the next book. So the next book, Captain Underpants and the Tyrannical Retaliation of the Turbo Toilet 2000. So these last two books, I kind of gotten older and moved on from the series at this point, but I still asked for these as Christmas gifts. I remembered just to, finish off this series that was kind of a childhood favorite of mine. And so I don't. So I probably don't remember the plots of these two as well as I remember the first 10, but I do think I remember enough to have a solid opinion on them. So Melvin, um, Melvin, or so there's a kickball at one point in book 5, which Robo George, because the Wedgie Woman created a robot version of George and Harold in that book. They kick a kickball into space. It heads towards Uranus, toward where the Robo Plunger is guarding all the dead talking toilets. The kickball hits the plunger in the head. It knocks it off. The juice that I guess keeps it alive falls into the mouth of the Turbo Toilet 2000, allowing him to come back from the dead. One little thing that annoyed me is how Uranus is a gaseous planet, but they make it have a solid surface in this series. But like I said before, with the other thing, it's a fictional series. What can you do? So the Turbo Toilet 2000 makes his comeback to Earth, chases Melvin around because now George Harold and Captain Underpants / Mr. Krupp are nowhere to be found at this time, and so Melvin has to defeat the Turbo Toilet 2000, and he does. But when he decides to track down George and Harold, because in defeating this Turbo Toilet 2000, he becomes a superhero, renowned by the town. They ask him for assistance on all sorts of stupid things, and he decides he wants George, Harold, and Captain Underpants back. So he tracks them down based on everything he could find. And by the way, Sulu and Crackers are the ones who set Tippy, the giant Tippy, back in time to before the universe existed. So they're out of the picture now. And so so Melvin tracks them down using this little tracking time travel device thing he has, goes forward in time the 30 years and retrieves them, bringing them back to the present, but in doing so, he also reset sort of the last week or whatever so that the Turbo Toilet 2000 thing never happened, so he didn't have to be a superhero anymore. And so they come back, and bear with me for a sec here. And then George and Harold are in huge trouble with their parents as well as the school because they missed out on so many things at school due to being away fighting all the crime with Captain Underpants. And so so to get out of this jam, they travel back in time using the squid machine. They steal the squid machine from Melvin, and then by going back in time one day, they clone it. And so they go back in time one day, they clone it that way, and then they take the test to get out of their issue. And because they went back in time one day, they now have run into themselves from the day before, and now there's 2 of each of them. They then water. So they then proceed to deal with Captain Underpants or not deal with Captain Underpants. So they take care of Captain Underpants, pour water on his head, make him go back to being Mr. Krupp. And then they're just kind of doing random things for a while. And eventually this doesn't result in. Eventually the Turbo Toilet 2000's return to Earth comes for them because Melvin kind of reset it so that it didn't happen yet. And then they have to deal with it. So while they're there, they're also guarding these eggs which Sulu and Crackers left behind because they discovered that Crackers was actually a girl. Uh, Her and Sulu reproduced and had these eggs, and so they create these hamster pterodactyl mixtures, which hatch at right around the time the Turbo Toilet 2000 comes, and uh, they I remember the three of them, because there's three of them, lift the Turbo Toilet 2000 right in the air and then drop him really far down, and he explodes into dozens of pieces everywhere, and that is the official end of the Turbo Toilet 2000 in the series. Another side plot that happens in this is because George and Harold cloned themselves, quote unquote, they convince the teachers that they're dreaming because they see two of them, and this causes the teachers to go crazy and all get arrested. Um, I thought that was pretty amusing, honestly. I would say that the sort of twists and turns in this plot that this one goes through were make it more interesting than kind of what the series started out with. But I still think that, excuse me, overall it was a little bit weaker the than some of the other better ones that came earlier in the series. So this one is going to go in A tier, but at the end. This brings me to the very final one in the series, Captain Underpants and the sensational saga of Sir Stinks-A-Lot. So this one picks up right from where it left off at the last one, but I wouldn't say this one's a direct continuation, the same way 6 to 7 and 9 to 10 were. Even though they do merge, the books 6 through 12 have the whole timelines merged together. But anyways, I'm gonna say this one was near the top. Maybe. This one, I'm gonna say this is a bold move because I know a lot of people really do not like this one. I'm gonna say this one was actually the best in the series. So the plot is their gym teacher, Mr. Meaner, like all the other teachers, is in the big house for being crazy after thinking he's dreaming. And so then there's this thing called Smart Earth, which Dav Pilkey just kind of pulled out of the air, which blows up, and one of the particles lands on regular Earth, and specifically in his jail cell, which he shares with all the teachers. He eats it, and this makes him super smart. So, if you don't know anything about Mr. Meaner or don't remember, he was a sort of recurring side character as a gym teacher in more than half of the previous books, I would say. And then in this one, he finally gets his time to shine. He becomes this really smart dude. He invents all of these. He invents all these things. He invents all these machines. He finds this way to possess children to be obedient to adults, which the whole relationship between children and adults is kind of a central theme throughout the series. If you've read the books, you would know what I'm talking about. And so he finds a way to possess them and make them obedient to him and other adults. But then, then George and Harold realize what's going on, and because they're the only ones who are not possessed by this, and or present day George and Harold, the yesterday Georges and Harolds, because they are because they are still together, the four of them. Not merge. Present day George and Harold are the only two that are safe from this, while yesterday George and Harold get possessed by Mr. Meaner's machine like everybody else does. And so Mr. Meaner, so they poke a hole in Mr. Meaner's plan by by convincing by dressing up as an adult and then telling children orders that um, go up against what Mr. Meaner was wanting them to do. Because kind of like how in the first book Mr. Krupp was making them do chores for him, Mr. Meaner was making all the kids do his yard work, his bills, all those types of things. And so, excuse me a second again. Water. Once more. And so eventually they have to. This causes Mr. Meaner to kind of go into a tailspin, and then eventually he finds a way to fuse his body with just this pure ball of energy, and becomes Sir Stinks-a-Lot. So George and Harold have to call in Captain Underpants once more to defeat him, and so they do, because or Captain Underpants does, because of course he does, and this ends up being the very final time that Captain Underpants ever shows up, because unlike all the other times where George and Harold had to pour water onto Captain Underpants to turn him back into Mr. Krupp, Sir Stinks-a-Lot releases this little spark of energy which turns him back into Mr. Krupp, causing him to flee from the scene. And when people snap their fingers in front of Mr. Krupp, he does not turn into Captain Underpants anymore. They never really explained the logic behind this, and so they never really explained the logic behind why that would permanently reverse Mr. Krupp back to his normal original self. But whatever works, I guess. It's a silly kids novel at the end of the day. And so Mr. Krupp is back to his normal self at the end. Sir Stinks-a-Lot melts into this whole blob, or melts into this whole goop. Mr. Meaner comes out back to his normal gym teacher self. And this time, because there's no more Captain Underpants to deal with and no more villains, George and Harold do not have their iconic "oh no, here we go again" as the very last two lines in the story. Instead, what actually happens is present-day George and Harold decide to take the Melvin time machine, that their cloned version of it, I guess, and go on a time-traveling adventure, while the yesterday George and Harold are able to peacefully make comics and do whatever they want now. And so that's the happy ending that the series finally gets after 12 full novels. Then there's the whole thing about adult George and Harold, which I guess yesterday George and Harold eventually grow up to become. And that's all I can really say about this book. I actually like the closure, and I like how Dav Pilkey took a character which was just kind of a humor gag in all the other books that he showed up in before that, and made him central to the story this time. I felt like that was actually a kind of fitting way to end it, without just completely deviating from what the core of the books were about. And that concludes my opinion on all of these books. So this video is really long, goodness gracious. So that's it for this video. I appreciate you all for tuning in and being patient with me, because I know I haven't been able to release a ton of videos. I have been busy with many other things. I've had other priorities. That's just how life is. And I do hope to continue doing my futuristic Mr. Incredible series. I have not forgotten about that. And I guess that's it. Have a nice day, everyone. Goodbye.